So on to our program. Dr. David Bachman is the Henry M. Jackson Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's also the former Associate Director of the Jackson School. His research and teaching interests include Chinese domestic and foreign policy, international political economy, Asian politics, and US-China relations. Dr. Bachman has actually written 3 books on China. Both his master's and doctorate degrees are from Stanford University. And Dr. Bachman, thank you very much for joining us this evening here in Zoomland. We appreciate you and your willingness to present your work. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and let me get this up and get running. I am very appreciative of this opportunity from the Olympia World Affairs Council. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I hope you feel the same way after you've been here and I go through this. So I'm going to speak today about China's Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes abbreviated as BRI, sometimes known as One Belt, One Road. It has been perhaps the signature international affairs development of China over the last now 7 years, associated very directly with Xi Jinping, China's leader. And it is something that has generated a huge amount of—
Hey, honey, can you turn yours off?
And it is something that the US government speaks about quite extensively. And so let me just dive in with this. Okay, so this Belt and Road Initiative is often compared to the ancient Silk Road, and I'll explain more about this in a minute. This ancient Silk Road was a connection across Eurasia that went back to the time of the Roman Empire, to China's first long-lasting empire, the Han Dynasty, back from 200 BC roughly to 200 AD. It had its ups and downs. It began to fade in the 16th century as Russia began to expand and push its empire out into Central Asia and began to put borders up. But this term, the Silk Road or Silk Roads, was coined by German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. He was the uncle of the World War I flying ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. But so it was a phenomenon that lasted for a very long time, but it really wasn't acknowledged as such in the languages of either of China or of other participants in what we now know as the Silk Road. But this history was the inspiration for China's Belt and Road Initiative, but Belt and Road is quite a bit different, as I'll get to. So the Silk Road was a series of exchanges, of trade, of people, of ideas, of goods. Religions moved from India to China and from other parts of across Eurasia. It was a series of movements. It wasn't centered on China. You could go from India to the Middle East, or from China to the Middle East, or from Afghanistan, or what we now know as Russia, and so on. So it wasn't centered. It was people, entrepreneurs of various sorts, moving across parts of this road. They didn't necessarily have to go from one terminus to another, and so on. Given the time that it took place, it was slow. You went either by foot or by camel or other beast of burden. So we're talking about 4 or 5 miles an hour when the terrain is reasonably easy to traverse if you're on an animal, and perhaps 2 or 3 miles an hour if you're going by foot. So this meant that you couldn't carry all that much, even with pack trains. So you carried things that were of high value, whether it was your religion that you wanted to share with others, whether it was spices that could bring high profits, So we're talking about high value trade and so on. We weren't talking about nations or state sponsorship. These were endeavors undertaken by tradesmen, by religious figures, by adventurers, by all sorts of people for personal reasons. Wasn't centered on any particular state. In fact, we're really talking about empires or traditional principalities. We're not really talking about modern states. And the Silk Road ebbed and flowed based on war. Uh, if there were wars or piracy or the equivalent of piracy, brigands on the Silk Road, that closed things down. If there was insecurity, when the bubonic plague broke out and traveled across the Silk Road to Europe, that closed it down too after the disease spread. In contrast, the Belt and Road was focused on infrastructure. Oops, sorry, went too fast. On infrastructure and trade. And the trade was supposed to be focused on China, to and from China, with the goal of aiming to increase speed and volume, to build networks across Eurasia that would integrate Eurasia in a much deeper way, would spread out from China and would sort of highlight China's centrality as the leading power of Eurasia. It was state-sponsored by China, and China was the core or the hub, and it was to serve China's interest as well as the interest of others. And it aimed for continuous and increasing integration, that the purpose was to deepen ties, to strengthen trade, to strengthen China's connections with the rest of Eurasia. And so how is the Silk Road and Belt and Road related? So from China's perspective, they are linked symbolically. And here I'm quoting from James Millward's book, The Silk Road, a very short introduction. The Silk Road stands for the idea that humanity has thrived most when connected across its far-flung habitats by exchanges of goods, ideas, arts, and people themselves. This understanding of our common world history stresses communication and interaction among peoples rather than differentiation and conflicts between them. These themes that the academic pulled out of the historical record, or at least the preferred version of the historical record perhaps, were echoed by Xi Jinping in his speech that launched the One Belt, One Road initiative in 2013. And he was speaking in Kazakhstan, and he said, throughout the millennia, the people of various countries along the ancient Silk Road have jointly written a chapter of friendship that has passed on to this very day. The over 2,000-year history of exchanges demonstrates that on the basis of solidarity, mutual trust, equality, inclusiveness, mutual learning, and win-win cooperation, countries of different races, beliefs, and cultural backgrounds are fully capable of sharing peace and development. This is the valuable inspiration we have drawn from the ancient Silk Road. We should take an innovative approach and jointly build an economic belt along the Silk Road. And so the land route that we'll see was the belt in the Belt and Road. The road is actually the sea route, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay. So that's the context for Belt and Road. But let me start with, or let me point out some of the difficulties of trying to understand what Belt and Road is. So it's an ongoing phenomenon. It's current events. So you don't have the kind of depth and historical perspective that we might prefer to make more sort of informed and careful judgments. We don't have access to many of the documents or speeches or behind the scenes stories that go into much of it. So we're missing, much of the iceberg, if you will. The part that I'm talking about is based on my own knowledge of China and the tip of the iceberg that's above the water level to give us a sense of what Belt and Road is. China is not fully transparent about what the Belt and Road is, what its project lists are, what aren't. Belt and Road projects. More generally, China isn't all that clear about what its goals are, and I'll give you my sense of what they are in a few minutes. Belt and Road also has taken on a rather expansionary rhetoric. This original idea of land and sea communications of integration are now joined by Chinese scholars and officials talking about a digital Silk Road, a cyber Silk Road, an Arctic Silk Road, a health Silk Road. Space is part of the Silk Road too. Latin America is now part of Belt and Road in some ways, obviously not historically connected to the Silk Road, and so on. So figuring out what the boundaries or what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is not an easy task. We don't know in many cases the terms of the projects, both explicitly and implicitly, what goes along with loans, what goes along with the various projects, how they're considered, what goes into making a project, and so on. We also have from the US administration and from many in the US, quite harshly critical views about Belt and Road. This is reflected in the media, reflected in think tank pieces, reflected on Capitol Hill and the White House, the State Department, and so on. More generally, we have a competitive, conflictual element to US, or overall element to US-China ties that even if Belt and Road might have been the best possible initiative, some of this competition, this conflict would probably color those views. And there's also all too often a lack of discussion of the role of the countries in which China is acting. So we have this image of China acting and the rest of the world sort of sitting back and sort of not interacting and sort of take what's given from the PRC. And that, I think, is a profound mistake in understanding what's going on. So here's a map of the traditional Silk Road to give you a sense of its various pathways, some of the goods that were traded on it. It goes up into Central Asia, it goes down into India and what's now Pakistan, through Iran, through to the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, ending in Constantinople, from which prior to 1453, Venice would trade and sell Chinese goods and spices from the East to Europe and so on. Okay, give you a sense of what some maps done by a German think tank, the Mercator Institute for Chinese Studies, shows you about Belt and Road. That these maps were done a couple of years ago. I haven't been able to find better ones. So the red are railroad lines that are being built. The yellow are gas pipelines, sort of brown or oil pipelines, ports you can see there. The green line in the ocean is part of the Maritime Silk Road, or the Maritime Belt and Road aspects. So you can see going around Russia through the Arctic Passage and through the Indian Ocean, up through the Suez Canal into Europe, and so on. There are building infrastructure, particularly power, is a fundamental aspect of Belt and Road. Unfortunately for the environment, China is committed to building something like, so far, 350 megawatts of coal power plants, 200 megawatts of renewable energy plants. Many of those are dams, not solar farms or anything else, some nuclear plants, and so on. And then the sort of major partner in all of this is, I got ahead of myself here. We have then digital connections on the Silk Road. We have the Digital Economy Cooperation Initiative in 2017 with a number of Asian and Southeast Asian and Central and Western Asia or Middle Eastern countries as part of that, one European country. This is where the US government complains about China pushing its champion cell phone and 5G producer Huawei to make that a global standard. And then we'll get to Pakistan. And Pakistan has been the most willing, if you will, and largest partner in the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, many of these projects were started before the Belt and Road Initiative was announced. But you can see that there's a lot going on in Pakistan by the PRC. Okay, so let me turn to some more analytic type of approaches here. So why did China launch this Belt and Road Initiative? Publicly, it said it did this to build friendly relations, to reassure its neighbors that China's economic rise to being the #2 power in the world was not going to be a threat to their economic and social well-being. So it was designed to build cooperative relations. Moreover, China pointed out that as the World Bank has, as the International Monetary Fund has, as many economic analysts have pointed out, that one of the major problems of the developing world, particularly in Asia, but in other parts of the world as well, was the shortage of infrastructure, perhaps $2 or $3 trillion shortage of what was being built between what was actually being built in terms of infrastructure versus what was needed. And China was going to step up and begin to supply some of those needs. And that spoke implicitly to a sort of sense that Chinese leaders, and indeed many in the Chinese population, began to feel that major powers or great powers have significant foreign aid and development programs. In some ways, they, as the Marshall Plan was for the US, a signature event in world history, or at least Cold War history after World War II. This was going to be the sort of way that China made its mark in terms of global development, in terms of foreign aid, in terms of leaving an imprint across the world. Less explicitly, and perhaps not nearly as benevolently, one might say that there was excess capacity in China's construction industry and other basic industries, that they had built so much infrastructure in China that there were fewer and fewer opportunities to build high-speed rail, for example, or to build superhighways and so on, that many of these large, globally competitive Chinese construction industries were finding less and less work, and they were going to lose some of their ability to make money, to employ people, to hold on to some of the skills they had acquired over the last 20 years or so. So there was an encouragement for them to participate in global development. As well, China was producing much more steel than it needed, and therefore it wanted to figure out ways to export some of that steel and other basic commodities. This would be a way to do it. There was resentment of the US, both by China towards the US and by parts of the world where the US was ignoring them, whether it was parts of Africa and Latin America, which have seen quite substantial Chinese initiatives, Central Asia as well. And so China was trying to portray itself as a better partner than the US might be. China also saw that it was rising in global power and status, that it knew from history that this often creates geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic tensions. And so China knew it would be challenging the US or be perceived as challenging the US. And it tried to channel this competition in not so confrontational ways, playing to China's strength, where China had a lot of capability of building things, a lot of recent experience in building up infrastructure, had a lot of savings that it could put into lending to developing countries. And while those were China's strengths, China's leaders also recognized that this was not an area of strength for the US. The US was critical, public opinion is critical of foreign aid, that bankers had been burned many times, lending to developing countries. There wasn't a lot of willingness to make lots of concessions to developing countries. As well, China is increasingly dependent on oil energy imports. Most of those have to sail around Southeast Asia through the Straits of Malacca, through the South China Sea to get to China. If you had a chance to look carefully at that map about energy projects I showed, pipelines are an important part of that. So there are pipelines connecting Russian oil fields to China, Kazakh gas fields to China, attempts to build pipelines across Myanmar or Burma that will offload oil from the Middle East and get it to China by pipeline rather than sailing further through the Straits of Malacca, and building up ports elsewhere where you might build pipelines in the future. Whether this really provides China with any more energy security is an open question, but nonetheless, it is one of the rationale behind China's attempts to build Belt and Road. It was to demonstrate China's power, to expand China's influence. If China built your fundamental infrastructure, if your roads and railroads and telecommunications infrastructure used Chinese equipment, if they were all destined to end up in China, China saw this as a gain for China's influence. It demonstrated China's power, and it did serve to try to make China the center of all Eurasia, all roads not leading to Rome, but to the PRC. So how does this actually work? So the a Chinese company, often a state-owned Chinese company, with government help, negotiates projects with a foreign government. Excuse me. The Chinese company then concludes a memorandum of understanding on the project. They report this to the foreign ministry and other ministries in China. They give it their blessing. Then the companies with the government backing go to Chinese banks, all of which are state-owned, asking for funding help to lend to the foreign government or to the Chinese company. The banks basically follow orders and lend the money in almost all cases. The banks don't do this at particularly good rates. They lend at commercial rates or close to it. So they're generally not terribly concessionary. The Chinese banks are calculating what it takes to make a profit on these. They're not giving many of these countries big breaks on the interest rates, but there's a caveat that will come with this in a minute or two. All loans and projects are insured by a Chinese insurance company, which adds more business to China. And then the companies with the money, with the approvals from both governments, will build the project using mostly Chinese equipment and workers, and then within a reasonable period of time, will conclude the project. So here are some of the examples, and if you look carefully, they'll tell you part of the story here. So what happened? So up in the upper left is the port of Gwadar in Pakistan. And you don't see a lot of big ships in Gwadar in Pakistan. One of its problems is it hasn't generated a lot of business. Immediately below that is the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. It too doesn't have a lot of activity, at least in this picture. So this raises questions about how viable some of these projects were. The top right picture is the port of Korgas on the border of China and Kazakhstan, a free port where there's supposed to be bonding and transfer of goods across a rail link that connects China first to Kazakhstan and then extends further out, ultimately getting to Europe. And the picture below is the first train that went from the Chinese city of Zhengzhou to Europe. And while there are now something on the order of something like 90 round-trip train trips, or there were before COVID anyway, round-trip trains from China to Europe, you should note that if those are filled with containers, basically it takes about 240 trains to equal one very large container ship. So it's still much more efficient, if slower, to move cargo by ship from Europe to China than it is by train. So all these raise questions about how viable some of these projects are. So what happened prior to COVID, or prior to, in China's case, January 21st, 2020? So there was extensive port, railway, and energy projects that were built, telecommunications and other infrastructure projects built, or in the process of being built. Perhaps, according to some estimates, as much as $575 billion worth of projects. There was growth in trade with China by countries with Belt and Road projects, serving other interests. It's not clear, though, that this was leading to higher rates of growth in Belt and Road partner countries. And it's also true that at least prior to COVID, China's influence seemed to be increasing in those countries with Belt and Road projects as well. But it wasn't all a bed of roses. So China tried to do too much too fast. There was an overexpansion. Company after company was trying to conclude deals, trying to get money to undertake projects that it was becoming impossible for people to process and understand the economic aspects of some of these deals in China. They were under pressure because Xi Jinping had made this a signature event to get things done. And so as a result, there was a bias in favor of approving too many things without careful investigation. Many of these turned out to be quite risky investments that, as we'll get to, many of these countries already had debt problems. And so China was just piling more debt onto them. And so that was going to create problems. As well, there was a lack of political risk assessment by China, that a number of these places are unstable. They've had changes of government who have been, with the new leaders, more critical of China, anxious to sort of cut back on what China had promised or was trying to deal with, and so on. So that was creating problems. There was a certain kind of pork barrel politics in China going on here, a sort of kind of corporate welfare being extended to steel mills and the construction industry and so on, to keep them employed, to sort of make sure that they didn't cut employment, which might cause upset by their workers, that might cause political problems. There were issues of China paying bribes to political leaders in Belt and Road countries. I've already mentioned the debt issues. I'll come back to the debt issues in a minute or two as well. So much was happening. China didn't have a handle on what was going on, how many deals were being concluded. And there is no publicly revealed Chinese list of Belt and Road projects. And I suspect that's because they don't actually know how many Belt and Road projects there are. Moreover, in 2019, China's economy began to cool. US and China got into a trade war beginning in 2018. And that was creating tensions in the relationship. It was creating stresses in the Chinese economy. And as a result of the trade war, the techno-nationalism that characterizes the US and China now, China needs to build up some of its own tech industry. That's going to take bank loans to do it. So there's been a shift away from funding international projects to domestic projects. There was an attempt to fine-tune Belt and Road in 2019, commitments to better research on projects, better terms of engagement, more control over the process by the government. And it was reported that something on the order of about $130 billion in contracts were signed in the first 11 months of 2019, up substantially from 2018. But there has been blowback about this. So I showed you the picture of the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which was actually a pet project of the then ruler of Sri Lanka. It was his hometown. He wanted to leave his mark on his hometown by building or having built this major port that was supposed to sort of revivify the economy of his area. And he was, in fact, the initiator of why don't you, China, build this port for us? He did. He did get China to do that, but that port wasn't all that efficient. There wasn't sort of a lot of enterprise around it, so there wasn't a lot of reason why people would stop their ships at Hambantota, and clearly Sri Lanka was not going to be able to pay for it. So China and the Sri Lanka government renegotiated, turned over a large territory to China on a 99-year lease that would allow the Chinese development company to build warehouses and perhaps create factories that would attract more business to the port. If you know your Chinese history, you know the British took a 99-year lease on the new territories in Hong Kong. This was an act of colonialism or neo-imperialism. Critics of China clearly pointed out the parallel here. This was neo-colonial Chinese taking over of Sri Lanka territory. Claims that Sri Lanka had lost sovereignty over part of its landmass, spiking nationalist reactions against China, and so on. And certainly the US has played this up, as have others. As well, strategists in the US and elsewhere, India in particular, talk about a string of pearls of China building ports that the critics say will become military ports for the Chinese Navy, and which would surround India, would try to make sure that Chinese oil shipments from the Persian Gulf would arrive safely in China. And as a part of this, China built its first military base abroad in the African country of Djibouti, which is near the mouth of the Red Sea. The US in particular has emphasized that China is creating debt traps, that it's sort of pushing projects on developing countries who can't afford them, can't service the loans that go behind them, that makes them have to renegotiate their loans, and sort of China extracts concessions from them in terms of renegotiating, as in this territory it took over, or so it said, in Hambantota. And so this is portrayed as China actually exercising control by the US. A better criticism in many ways is that few in the local population were employed on the projects. And so there wasn't a lot of spillover in terms of economic contributions to the local economy. There weren't a lot of skills that were transferred to the local people to make them more competitive and able to run modern industry. This in turn led to a reaction against the Chinese presence. It's led to elections where the party that had backed China, Chinese projects, lost elections, and the new ruling government renegotiating the terms or ending the projects. It led to protests, and it led in a number of cases to violence against Chinese who lived in these places or who were working there. It has stimulated some competition from Japan, Australia, India, and the EU to a degree to up their own game in foreign aid and projects in developing countries. One key actor in many of the Belt and Road projects is the China technology champion, Huawei. And this is seen as a security threat, according to the US, in terms of China able to gather all sorts of information about or mine data and so on. and it's led to sharpening geostrategic and geoeconomic rivalry between the US and the PRC. So if we address this blowback, in Hambantota, it looks bad, but that it's over-exaggerated in the sense it was driven by the local leader. It's now turning a profit after some of the investment is there, that the Chinese company has a board of directors that have equal number of Sri Lankan citizens on it. So it's not clearly as neo-colonial, or doesn't seem as neo-colonial as it first appeared, or is often portrayed. With the string of pearls and the base, France and the United States also have bases in Djibouti. Japan has talked with Djibouti about setting up a base there. So it's not as if China is monopolizing Djibouti or doing anything that other major powers aren't doing. And the string of pearls, the ports that China has built so far, there's no sign of any kind of military prep for these. No military radars, no hardening of the sites, no surface-to-air missiles, all the kinds of things that would be necessary to create sort of real naval bases as opposed to commercial ports. There is truth in the debt trap claim, but it misses the key issue. And that key issue is that China has about 90 partners in Belt and Road. 60 of those under sort of Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and other international rating services have negative credit ratings. They're junk bond status, if you will, so that Western banks are not going to lend to them. They already had severe, in many cases, debt issues. And debt was growing across the developing world throughout the 20-teens, according to a major World Bank study, not necessarily due to China, but for a variety of reasons. And so the choice for many developing countries was, we either we get money from China because they're the only ones willing to lend, to build up our infrastructure, to make our economy better, or we remain mired in poverty and don't have a chance to develop. With regard to Huawei, there's no proof that, at least publicly provided, that there are the kinds of backdoors in Huawei products that would enable China to gain intelligence data from that. US says that's classified. So we're waiting perhaps for more conclusive kind of evidence that it really is as dangerous as the US says. And the US the US critique fails to consider why countries are anxious to have Belt and Road projects. And that's my next slide. So think about this. The politicians in these developing countries want to stay in power. And a way to do that is to create benefits for their constituents, to provide economic growth, jobs, payoffs to constituents, or patronage to clients, where many of these societies want modernization. They want a higher standard of living. Indeed, some of them are corrupt and see Belt and Road as a means for further enrichment, but nonetheless, in many cases, it's the local leader who's the driver behind this. It's not China sort of pushing them on it or finding an unwilling audience when they do make an appeal. Many of the Belt and Road projects are for infrastructure, so that takes lots of capital up front, long construction periods, and a long time to repay. So you can build roads, you can build railroads, they facilitate trade, but it takes a while for the trade to get going, to be able to be collected, at least in part, as taxes, and then to be able to pay off the loans that you achieve. The conditions that go along with infrastructure are not all that attractive to international financial markets. They want faster payoff, higher rate of return, et cetera, et cetera. As already pointed out, many countries are already heavily indebted. They couldn't borrow from global financial markets. China is in some ways the lender of last resort. And it's a mistake, as I've already suggested, to think that Belt and Road states are passive recipients of Chinese largesse or ensnarement. So for the US, I'd argue the US needs to stop complaining and needs to compete more equally in some ways. So the US government sees Belt and Road as a plot by China to entrap countries in debt to extract strategic concessions. The record really doesn't show that as a coordinated strategy of entrapment. US sees China and Russia as strategic rivals. So the US response to that has basically been militarized, to build up the military, to sort of try and build ties with allies. But Belt and Road is political economic. So we're not matching apples to apples here. We're apples and oranges. The US didn't recognize some of its international lending, did reorganize some of its international lending and insurance agencies, but continued to rely on private finance and companies, in other words, for profit. At the same time, the US was cutting foreign aid. So again, that's playing into China's hands. And the US remained committed to sort of market-driven Washington consensus, as it was called, neoliberal policy responses to developing countries. The record of that over the last 30 years has not been very good. Maybe the US position is changing, but nonetheless, the US doesn't have a lot of success in promoting development internationally outside of a few countries in Asia. And so it's time for the US to rethink what it's doing here to compete with China in Belt and Road, and if appropriate, provide more resources. So going forward, Belt and Road will continue. China will learn how to better coordinate and evaluate projects. Problems will remain. There's motivation for many other countries to participate in Belt and Road. That's likely to remain high. Belt and Road will contribute to the internationalization of the Chinese currency. It'll gradually weaken the dollar-based international financial system by using the Chinese currency in more and more transactions. There's some sign that quiet opposition to Belt and Road may emerge among ordinary Chinese as they wonder why so much of money is going out of the country and when China is still not all that rich. So who knows what the US will do as well. Just to bring this up to date for with COVID. So the pandemic is affecting all Belt and Road states, China and everyone else included. So there's not a lot of construction going on existing projects, not a lot of new negotiations on projects. The ability to repay existing projects declines as the world economy declines. So there's the global economic slowdown that puts limits on Belt and Road projects, new ones and funding current ones. China has stimulated its own economy by expanding its credit, so its own debt and its own economic revival are an issue. It's growing at 1.8%, making it one of the few countries that is growing, but nonetheless, not robustly. This global economic slowdown means that it's more and more difficult for countries to export and to earn money to pay back debt owed to China. Zambia and Kenya already are calling on China to renegotiate the terms of their debt. But China has added health diplomacy, the health Silk Road to this. China is the major maker of much of the world's personal protective equipment, masks, a lot of drugs as well. And China has been freely dispensing these, or not necessarily freely, but often providing lots and lots of this kind of equipment. COVID-19, of course, has heightened US tensions. And so just to conclude, Belt and Road may become more important to Eurasian countries, less to China, and just one of a litany of US criticisms of the PRC. So let me stop there and stop my screen share, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Bachman, for that presentation. We already have a couple of questions in the chat room, so let me go there and see if I can start with the first one. To what extent does the BRI include Chinese humanitarian aid projects or other direct aid?
As with Belt and Road, it's very difficult. China isn't all that public about what is direct aid, what is concessionary loans, what is sort of a Belt and Road. So China does not provide a huge amount of foreign aid as we in the West know about it, or of humanitarian aid. So it's estimated somewhere between $5 and $10 billion a year goes into that. And even the US, I think, figured the last time I looked was something on the order of 35 billion. So it's not all that concessionary, and so on. China has, though, set up other kinds of development banks, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which does provide concessionary loans, which China is the major backer of. There's something called the BRICS Bank, composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that also lends in concessionary terms to developing countries. So those don't count directly as Chinese government activities, but that they're part of an array of Chinese involvement in the world that might count as concessionary. But that China's foreign aid in the strict sense is not huge.
So the next question we have is, do you think BRI will continue once Xi Jinping is no longer in power?
Well, I mean, Xi Jinping shows no sign that he's anxious to leave power. So I would think that we're talking at least 5 more years, if not 10 more years at a minimum. And so certainly, as he has invested so much into it, that it will continue as long as he's around. I think that some of these things really are going to start to pay off as the infrastructure is built, as the connections become closer, as development takes place. And so it won't be perhaps as much of building new projects as much as expanding on existing ones, of cultivating the benefits that come from expanding economic opportunities both in China and in Belt and Road partner countries. So I don't see Belt and Road going away, although as it matures, as China's connections with these places deepen, presumably, the nature of the Belt and Road will undergo its own kind of changes and transformations.
And are there Belt and Road Initiative projects in Africa linked, especially linked to resource extraction?
There are Chinese oil companies in Nigeria, in Angola, in South Sudan, in Libya. There may be others as well, that for iron ore, copper, there's investment in Zambia, which is a major copper producer, and attempts to get into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but the situation in there is so chaotic that there hasn't been a lot. Other sort of important minerals for manganese and is also mined in Africa. China's built a railroad in Kenya that connects Nairobi, the capital, to Mombasa, replacing the old British railroad that the maximum speed was about 20 miles an hour to one that now is 60 miles an hour. And presumably that certainly suits needs in Kenya, but it would also be a means by which ore and other commodities could be moved out of the heart of Africa to a major port on the Indian Ocean in Africa. And there are similar projects underway, or at least were discussed. So yes, China has invested heavily in Africa. It's now quickly moving up in terms of relative standing. That we've made a lot about Chinese activities in Africa, but Britain, France, the US still are larger investors in Africa than China. There's been a lot of Chinese investment in Latin America too, which China now sees as Belt and Road activities. Again, copper in Chile, Peru, and elsewhere.
So you just touched on this a bit, David, about the railroad in Kenya, but there's a question, are there high-speed rail Belt and Road projects using Chinese technology?
Yes, they're trying to build them through through Laos into Southeast Asia, trying to get them into Cambodia, trying to get Malaysia to accept them, competition with Japan for building a high-speed link on Java in Indonesia. And so China does want to expand the Belt and Road network. Much of what has been built in terms of railroads so far, though, in Central Asia remains more traditional diesel-powered engines with maybe a top speed of 60 to 90 miles an hour. But that clearly is something that China is trying to market, which has a certain kind of product identification with China. They do face competition from France and from Japan, but that the vision probably is to extend high-speed rail all the way to Europe.
And so this is one professor to another, Professor Bachman, from Professor Tom Rainey of Evergreen. Please comment on Russian and Chinese relations over the BRI and also on Kazakh-Chinese relations over BRI.
They're complex. That you get Chinese scholars arguing that China has a very strong, good strategic relationship with Russia. You have many analysts in the West saying that you have an alliance of convenience between the US and Russia. And you have certainly shared interest between Russia and China about aspects of the international order, probably similar views of the United States about, parenthetically, both Russia and China were voted to the Human Rights Council at the United Nations, which, needless to say, suggests that the Human Rights Council at the UN is not going to play a terribly active role in promoting human rights. But Russia is worried about China's continued economic vitality, that Russia historically has seen Central Asia as part of its sphere of influence. It sees greatly deepening Chinese ties with Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and others. And it takes a quite wary view of those sorts of things. As well, the population of Russia continues to decline, particularly in the Asian part of Russia, or Russia east of the Ural Mountains, so that there's something like all of 30 million people east of the Urals for an area that is, by itself, would still be the world's largest country if it was an independent state. And so there's fear of Chinese expansion, of population pressures, and so on. So Russia is quite wary. In terms of Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs are, obviously they border on China. They're a much smaller population, much weaker economically. It's clear that the Chinese state has quite good relations with the Kazakh government, which is not terribly democratic, to put it mildly. And so at the elite level, there are correct and good relations, and China continues to want to advance Belt and Road projects, deepen its ties with Kazakhstan. At a popular level, though, many Kazakhs are quite critical. They don't see a lot of benefits floating to their pocketbook. They see lots of sort of Chinese merchants moving in, trying to displace local commercial networks. And since China produces so many consumer goods, they have an advantage in that way. There have been riots in Kazakhstan protesting against Chinese presence. There have been attacks on Chinese merchants and occasionally Chinese officials, so that you have resentment building up in society, or at least some aspects of it. As well, many in Kazakhstan are very critical, if they know about it, about the repression that's going on against Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and other non-ethnic Chinese in Xinjiang.
We have another question here. If Biden is elected president, if you were advising President Biden, what would you suggest his approach be to the Belt and Road Initiative?
You know, if I were advising him, and I know that this would not be something that Congress would be enthused about, I would say you've got to put more money into the World Bank, into the International Monetary Fund, into the Asia Development Bank, to fund them to do more infrastructure funding. You need to do more in terms of American foreign aid. And coordinate with allies about their aid programs, so that that we're not reduplicating efforts, that we're working to create opportunities for them, so that we are in fact saying to developing countries, we do care about development. We're here to be partners with you. And so in that sense, I'd argue that you need to sort of play the same game that China's playing, not in the same way, and certainly not to the same extent. But if you prioritize certain parts of the world, such as Latin America, then there needs to be more done to promote development in Latin America. And if that would extend to other countries that might have some strategic import to the US, have raw materials or other things that are important to the US, provide subsidies for US firms to invest when they think that there's not a good chance for profitability in building infrastructure or mines or anything else. So, you know, I think you are going to have to play China's game to an extent, more than the US has been willing to do it for the time being.
Interesting. And our last question to you is to name a few, if any, U.S. companies that have or will benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative, and why.
That's a particularly tough question, given that basically the State Department and the White House are giving messages that certainly the countries involved shouldn't be part of Belt and Road. So how they'd feel about American companies being involved in Belt and Road. You know, to the extent that development takes place, one would imagine that that would go along with expanding air fleets once we get over COVID. So presumably Boeing would be in a position to benefit. You know, General Electric makes many quite powerful diesel electric train engines. It makes many kinds of generators that might be used for some of these things. So that would be another potential company. It would depend too on, you know, most of the rest of the world doesn't have the great firewall like China does. So presumably Facebook, Google, and others would be able to expand their presence in these companies. Apple would. They'd be competing against Huawei and others, but they would have potentials there. And then to the extent that the US is selling arms to these places or that they have strategic interest, US arms sales would presumably follow in at least some of these places. So there would be some that would down the road, to use a word I've been using a lot today, gain something out of this potentially.
Okay. All right. Well, that comes to the end of our questions that were put in the chat room to you, Professor Bachman. So thanks for your thoughtful answers. And thank you once again for joining us this evening. This has been wonderful. I don't think I knew anything about this before this presentation. So this was great. So thank you. And thanks to everybody who joined us out there in Zoom land. More than 60 of you were with us this evening for this presentation. So that's really great. And then think about joining us next month on Thursday evening, November 19th. We will be hearing from UPS Professor of History, Benjamin Tromley, who will be giving a presentation on democratic backsliding in the European Union. So that should be even as interesting as you were this evening, Professor Bachman. All right, I think that does it for everything. Any other board members have any announcements for the good of the order before we sign off for the evening? I'm not hearing any, I'm not seeing any. All right then. Thank you all very much. See you again next month. Thank you, Professor Bachman.
Thank you.